You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So friends, I'm Jim Cantelon, this is JCT TV, and we have now for, I think we're in our 5th year, been walking slowly but surely through the Gospels. As I recall, the first year and a half I went through the Gospel of John, and then about 3.5 years ago started again with Matthew. So we've been doing Matthew, Mark, and now we're in Luke, and we're going to finish Luke really soon. Then we're going to do the book of Acts, and then we're going to do the book of John again. So we got a lot ahead of us, and we'll get going right after this break.
In Africa, even the most basic medical aid is often non-existent. It is a continent that has been ravaged by disease. Malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, and AIDS are unrelenting. Every man, woman, and child suffers from a lack of adequate health care. Even treatable illnesses like diarrhea and upper respiratory infections can prove deadly. Clinics are too few and often beyond the reach of those in rural areas. WOW, working for orphans and widows, is equipping mobile medical clinics with knowledge and tools to reach out to the sick. Trained nurses are treating the ill. Communities are being educated on hygiene and disease prevention. Voluntary counseling and testing for HIV and AIDS is also offered through the clinic. Fear of stigma and discrimination keeps many from being tested for HIV. Nurses address this issue. They work to provide emotional and medical support for those who test positive for the virus. Communities are being transformed through education and medical treatment brought by mobile clinics. Knowledge about disease transmission is changing behaviors and preventing many illnesses. Basic health care prevents needless deaths. Voluntary counseling and testing has also curbed the spread of AIDS.
Many people have learned a lot about HIV/AIDS. Since we are taught, we are trained as community health workers, we have the knowledge, we give it to them, even through role plays and everything, even by talking to them as we go in the villages. So now people are aware what HIV/AIDS is, how it can be prevented, how it can be infected, and all that.
By supporting WOW's Working for Orphans and Widows mobile medical clinics, you can bring hope to countless communities. You can save a life.
Last time, friends, we were right in the middle of Luke chapter 23, verse 26, and I was just giving you a little background on Simon the Cyrenian, or from Cyrene, which northern Africa, Libya. He would have been a Jew living there in North Africa who had come up to Jerusalem for Passover. And as Jesus is being led to Calvary, there's this milling crowd, and Jesus is already perhaps stumbling because of the loss of blood from the scourging he'd received. And so the soldiers force Simeon, to carry, I think it's called the patibellum, but the cross piece, the horizontal cross piece for the cross. I just want to kind of paint a bit more of a picture for you here. The narrow streets of Jerusalem do not handle a crowd well. I know this from personal experience. I've been caught several times over the years I lived there, and then in subsequent years I've been doing television production there, in both festive and mournful crowds of thousands, and I mean thousands. I remember one time unintentionally I got caught and jammed really in with thousands of people for a very important Muslim holiday that was happening at the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock. And I literally had to just move as the crowd moved. There was no way I could move forward or backwards, right or left on my own. I had to go with the crowd. That's how jammed, shoulder to shoulder, chest to back. And in this case with very loud shouting people. And you shuffle along at a snail's pace with either shouts of joy or wailings of sorrow splitting your eardrums. It can be a touch scary. You're caught, you have no control. Escape, impossible. So, as I read Luke's account of the great multitude of ululating women lamenting Jesus' plight in verse 27, you can be sure it was chaotic. Okay, let's pick it up there. A great multitude of people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. Lamenting meaning ululation. It's a kind of you've heard the high-pitched ululation of Middle Eastern women, and also African women do it as well. And it can be very, very loud. It can carry a long distance. And if it is in mourning, it is indeed mournful, very disturbing. Jesus turns to them and says, verse 28, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children, for indeed the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, breasts which never nursed. They'll begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, to the hills, cover us. It's really, really something when you think about it. Jesus is what this is all about. Thousands of people pressing in against one another, following the soldiers and Jesus to Calvary. The crowd is in front of the procession. The crowd is behind the procession. The streets are too narrow for them to be on either side of the procession, but the streets are absolutely jammed. So Jesus is totally caught in this heaving mass of humanity. And in the midst of all of this, and the loud wailing, and his weakness, and his back is bloodied and bleeding, and he's about to die, he shows compassion to the women, warning them that a day would come when they'd prefer death by earthquake or landslide to the intense suffering that would come upon him. He knew what they didn't know, that his crucifixion would be a watershed. And then he says, for if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? You say, what does he mean by that? Right now, at that moment, Jerusalem was relatively green. But once dry, she would burn in a great conflagration of divine wrath. This was prophetic, because a few decades later, his words would come tragically true. And if you want to read the record for yourself, Google Josephus, Wars of the Jews, Book 6, or order the book online. Everyone's library should have Josephus. Josephus, Josephus, just like it sounds. Jewish historian. The siege of Jerusalem, which happened about 40 years later, 70 AD, was horrific. The Roman forces came in because of a constant rebellion on the part of Jewish insurrectionist groups, zealot groups. I mean, the situation had become just too difficult for Rome to handle. And so the emperor sent his son Titus to come in and, with a huge army, surround Jerusalem, lay siege, and eventually destroy it. It took quite a while for that to happen. The tragedy of the situation, as I read it, is not what was happening outside the walls with the Romans, but what was happening inside the walls with Jew on Jew. There were at least 3, maybe 4 zealot groups. These were, we'd call them today terrorist groups, who had their own agendas, who were murderous, who hated one another. It was kind of like the gang war we're seeing in parts of our world. Haiti would be a case in point. Gang on gang war. You see this in some of the prisons in Central America. Gang on gang war and horrible deaths. This was really what was happening inside the city. So the Romans are out there laying siege, horrible situation, not enough water, not enough food, no breakthrough to the outer world. It's only a matter of time and they're going to be totally destroyed. So while they're waiting for that to happen, they're destroying each other. These insurrectionists, these zealots, killing one another, this gang warfare. Josephus describes the horrors of it. There were times when you couldn't walk the streets without stepping over bodies. Sometimes you couldn't keep your balance because you were slipping on the cobblestones that were wetted with blood. Absolutely horrific. And one of these gangs even began to slaughter people in the temple area and totally, destroyed any sanctity or holiness that the temple had. Any way you look at it, Jesus, he knew this was coming. And so he's saying to these women, you think it's bad now. It's going to be a lot worse, to the point where you're going to pray for an earthquake or for some other kind of natural catastrophe to swallow you up or crush you beneath the weight of its stones, because the horror is just going to be unimaginable. That's really what he's talking about here. Okay? So let's get to verse 32. There were also 2 others, criminals, led with him to be put to death. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right, the other on the left. Now, there are 2 Calvaries in Jerusalem today. Both are marked by hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who visit Jerusalem every year. The oldest is now within the city in what's known as the Holy Sepulchre. The younger one is adjacent to the garden outside of the Damascus Gate. One was discovered by, and I put discovered in parenthesis here, by Saint Helena, the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine, in the 4th century. The other, outside the Damascus Gate, was discovered by British General C.G. Gordon in the 19th century. Centuries of pilgrimages bear witness to the tradition that Saint Helena got it right, whereas the Garden Tomb advocates only claim that Gordon's Calvary is an excellent visual aid. Most of the Garden staff used to attend King of Kings, the church that I founded in Jerusalem back in the 80s, and they would admit, this is a visual aid. Don't become dogmatic about this place. But you can Google Church of the Holy Sepulchre or Gordon's Calvary, and you'll get some pictures and you'll get a pretty good overview of it. I spent hours in each. Personally, I love them both. I don't know if either is the actual site, but I think most archaeological studies suggest that St. Helena, Constantine's mother, may have been on the right track, okay? And you need to get over there and see it for yourself and study it for yourself before you make any final decision on how you see it. I'll be back right after this.
Assure you, from the inside, it is happening. God is our hope. God is all we believe in, this God. And he has called us to be the repairers of wars and to take care of the widow and the orphan in their time of need. And that is exactly what we do. Lives are changing. Why? Because Jesus is Lord. And why? Because Christians have come together as a body. The united body of Christ is coming and saying, it stops with this generation. We break it and we move on.
The kind of religion that God endorses is to care for orphans and widows in their distress, justice, and to keep oneself unpolluted from the world, righteousness.
I mentioned the two Calvaries, and there are two Calvaries. Neither necessarily is the authentic spot, although the one that now is covered with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre perhaps has more archaeological evidence than the one outside the gate of the Damascus Gate. But both were outside the gate in Jesus' time. This underlines the fact that execution sites were never within the city proper. The Romans didn't want bodies up next to their restaurants, for sure. And for the Jews, dead bodies were not to be touched. Dead bodies were to be respected. Cemeteries were holy places. In fact, they used to paint their cemetery monuments white so that it would provide warning that you not step inadvertently on the grave, because to do so was to desecrate it and also to desecrate yourself. So these execution sites, for the Romans, crucifixion; for the Jews, stonings, horrible way to die. They were placed by the Romans and the Jews on major roads leading to and from any major urban area, because maximum visibility would be a great deterrent, maximum input, if you will, or impact, to try to curb unlawful behavior. So these execution grounds were used by both Romans and Jews. The Romans crucified their victims, Jews stoned theirs. Insurrectionists, criminals were crucified, blasphemers, adulterers, and heretics were stoned. Right? The public stood by while these executions, crucifixions, stonings were taking place. The victims of stoning would bleed to death at the feet of the people. Often a place of execution by stoning would be a stone quarry, where they were chipping away at major stones in their building projects, but there'd be all kinds of, ragged, jagged detritus. And ideal, pick it up and use that to hit somebody in the head, throw it at them when they're bleeding and dying. And as I mentioned earlier, the victims of crucifixion were at eye level. Brutal, nasty stuff. So, depending on the language, the site of Jesus' crucifixion was Calvaria, Calvaria, which is Latin. Cranion, Kranion, which is Greek. Golgotha, Golgotha, which is Hebrew. But they all have the same meaning: skull. Skull Hill. That's Calvary, Skull Hill. And sometimes it's referred to just simply as Skull Hill. Luke, summarizing as usual, as any historian will do, he gives no descriptive detail. He simply states, there they crucified him. And even as he's hung on the cross beside two other criminals who were crucified on either side, he prays for his enemies. The soldiers aren't listening. They're too keen casting dice to get their hands on that gorgeous robe that Herod had draped over Jesus' shoulders. There's gawkers gawking, mockers mocking, and even one of the two criminals on either side of Jesus sneers at him. Let's pick that up. First of all, Jesus prays for those who are crucifying him. Verse 34, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. They divided his garments, cast lots. The people stood looking on, but even the rulers with them sneered, saying, he saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. Soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. And an inscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, this is the king of the Jews. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you're the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you're under the same condemnation? We indeed justly receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now this is really something. You had gawkers gawking, mockers mocking, soldiers sneering, the crowd fulminating and being nasty. And there above his head, there's a sign affixed in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. This is the King of the Jews. Now, if you're wondering about that, wonder no longer. Pilate wanted to cover his back by representing Jesus as an insurrectionist, a would-be king. You know, he was concerned about the paper trail, if you want to use an analogy. He wanted it to be clear that he, as the Roman procurator, was acting in the best interests of Rome by crucifying an insurrectionist, not a would-be Messiah, not the Son of God, but an insurrectionist, all right? This is the King of the Jews. But, and this is a big but, Pilate also was very clever. And he had it up to here with these religious authorities who just hated Jesus, who just violently hated him and wanted him gone as, you know, a self-proclaimed Messiah and Son of God. Pilate puts the sign up over his head because he wants to give an in-your-face insult to these religious leaders who had insisted on Jesus' death by announcing to the world, thus the three languages, Jesus was the Messiah. So I protect my back by saying I'm crucifying the King of the Jews, but I make sure it's in three languages so the whole world knows that I am also crucifying the one that they hate because he is their king. Fascinating, huh? And then, irony of ironies, the very first person to enter paradise, get this, with the crucified Lord, was a repentant criminal. His entry must have made the angels sing. The number one trophy of grace was a criminal, probably a murderer, an insurrectionist, an evil man. That should bring some comfort to those of us who have sinned, and some of us feel we've sinned greatly. You know, the Apostle John says something in one of his epistles that's really very comforting. He says, look, friends, when your heart condemns you, God is greater than your heart and knows everything. He knows the circumstances. He knows your upbringing. He knows the pressures. He knows the stresses. He knows your state of mind. He knows everything. And his blood keeps on cleansing us from all sin. The Greek continuous present there is just so comforting. When Jesus' blood covered our sin on Calvary, it was a continuous covering. And he continues to cover us as we sin. And this is not to give license to sinful behavior, but what it is a tremendous reassuring truth that there is nothing that can break the bond between our loving Heavenly Father and them who he knows are his. So be comforted with that. Okay, let's pick it up. Verse 44. It was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened. The veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. Darkness descended on Jerusalem from noon to 3 p.m. And this wasn't because of some volcanic ash cloud. This was something that was absolutely unexplainable. As the darkness descended, at the 3rd hour, with the 6th hour, I should say, with a loud voice, Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, and breathed his last. At that moment, verse 45, the sun's darkened, the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, He breathed his last. So when the centurion saw what happened, he glorified God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. So the sun darkens, and the temple veil, which separated the people from God 6 inches deep, was torn apart. Talk about this veil, this temple veil being torn in two. This had to be a supernatural act because it was richly and heavily woven, perhaps as thick as 6 inches, decorated with cherubim, blue, scarlet, purple linen. It hung from 4 pillars of acacia wood. It provided a veritable impassable barrier, both symbolically and physically. And only once a year the high priest would go in behind that to the Holy of Holies. But you see the symbolism here. That dividing wall between the people and between the holy presence of God was ripped apart. The death of Christ on Calvary's cross ripped apart the barrier between man and God and gave mankind, which includes you and me, access to our Heavenly Father. No holds barred. It's beautiful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.